in psychology.
Well, I'm sorry, I didn't mean
You could
to...
learn a lot from children. They believe in things in the dark until we tell them it's not so. Maybe we've been fooling them.
This association between these elemental beings. And you're right, even stories in my hometown, I live near Avebury Henge in Wiltshire, there has been abductions reported by an antiquarian called John Aubrey of the Fae, where he took somebody into a mound.
History hates a vacuum. Improvisation, some of it very sincere, fills the gaps. It would have been easy to falsify a past back then. A few words, credulity, time would do the rest.
So it's very intriguing that they were drawn to these sites. And there's a place in Scotland that has flare-ups of radiation as well. So it's not just in the south of England that the situation has been recorded.
We can't see it, we can't hear it, we can't weigh it, we can't measure it in a laboratory.
Ancient writers were saying there was oracles said at Stonehenge.
It is a subjective sense of becoming what we are. Instead of what we were a nanosecond ago, becoming what we will be in another nanosecond.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
Have you ever wondered why some things persist? Why certain practices, no matter how primitive or irrational they seem, never really die? Dowsing, for example. A man holding a forked stick, walking over the earth, claiming he can feel... something? It sounds absurd, doesn't it? Like an old wives' tale. But here's the thing. Tales like that don't survive for centuries without a reason. Maybe it's because they're onto something we've forgotten, something we're too modern, too scientific to even notice anymore. The Earth itself isn't just a ball of dirt and water spinning in the void of space. It's alive. It breathes. More importantly, it hums with energy. And ancient cultures believed the planet was threaded with this energy, veins of power running just beneath the surface, connecting everything. People, places, even thoughts. They called them dragon lines or ley lines, and today, we call them superstition. But what if those lines are real? Think about it. Why is it that the greatest monuments of antiquity, Stonehenge, the Great Pyramid of Giza, Angkor Wat, are all perfectly aligned, not just with stars, but with each other? Why do we find these sacred sites built along invisible pathways that stretch for thousands of miles? Now, you could call that coincidence, but if you map them out, the pattern becomes undeniable, like a web of purpose crisscrossing the globe. And then there are these elongated skulls, Paracas, Peru, found in Malta, Siberia. And these aren't just curiosity, they're anomaly. Sure, some of them were shaped deliberately, but not all of them. Some of these skulls have features that don't belong to Homo sapiens. Sutures in the wrong places, cranial capacities too large, bone structures that don't make sense. And here's the unsettling part. These beings, whoever or whatever they were, seem to have understood those energy lines better than we ever could. Why did they build their tombs, their altars, their temples, exactly where those lines intersect? Why did they always congregate at places where the Earth's magnetic field fluctuates, where compasses spin and electronics fail? These weren't merely accidents. They knew, and maybe they weren't alone. And here's a thought to keep you up at night. What if those skulls weren't shaped that way by primitive humans trying to mimic the gods? But something else, something that was already here, something that left its mark on the world and then vanished? Or maybe they didn't vanish at all. Maybe they're still here watching us stumble through the ruins of what they left behind. And we're too blind to see the breadcrumbs they scattered across the centuries. And this idea of dowsing, what if that's just a faint echo of their knowledge, a distant memory passed down through generations? Sure, it's diluted, maybe even corrupted, until we were all left as this idea of a man holding a stick, and maybe not even realizing they're holding the key to a lost science. Sure, I've seen what happens to people who try to dig too deep into these things. They go crazy. They disappear. They wander off somewhere. Maybe they're paranoid. And maybe people who say that are right. But it's like I can't shake this feeling that we're playing with fire. We're standing on the edge of something vast and ancient. And the ground beneath us isn't as solid as we think. And maybe that's why they don't want us to believe in dowsing or ley lines or elongated skulls. Because once you start believing, the world doesn't look the same anymore. You start seeing things the way that they don't want you to see. And then you have to ask yourself the hardest question of all. What if the Earth doesn't belong to us at all? Enjoy the show.
The rolling plains of Wiltshire, England have long been home of a mystery far older than any secret anybody could dream of. Stonehenge, an enigma of massive stones aligned with the stars. But there's something the history books don't tell you. Beneath its withered surface, a more ancient truth hides. Maria Wheatley, a modern-day oracle of hidden knowledge, has uncovered evidence of an unknown people. Long-headed rulers of prehistoric Britain. Their skulls, elongated and eerie, have been found in the burial mounds surrounding the site, hinting at a civilization wiped from history by forgotten violence. Who were they? Why were they erased from time? In this case, we might find that the more we dig, the more we uncover a truth that humanity may never have been meant to know. Maria, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Could you tell the audience a little bit about your history, who you are, and what it is that you do?
Sure. I'm a dowser. I'm a second-generation dowser, and I'm a research author. I visit sacred sites worldwide. I've dowsed in 17 different countries, from the pyramids to Stonehenge, as you've just mentioned. And I really like to delve deeply into the mysteries of the ancient world.
And you've been doing this for quite a long time.
Yes, about 30 years now.
And as we were talking about Stonehenge and the title of your most recent book,
The Secret History of Stonehenge.
And in it, you talk about a theory that Stonehenge itself may have originally been a temple dedicated to a goddess of reincarnation.
That's right. If we look at Stonehenge Phase 1, there's many different phases to Stonehenge. The phase that we're all familiar with is called Stonehenge phase 2, with the lintels, and it looks giant. But preceding that, maybe as much as 500 years or so before, there was a henge, which is a white ditch and a bank, and that enclosed 56 blue stones. Now, at the zenith of that monument and the later zenith of phase 2, it aligned perfectly to a constellation called Corona Borealis, and the brightest star, Gemma or Alphecca, that was at the center of Stonehenge in that era. And so it really is quite powerful. And in later Iron Age myths, that's of the Druids' fame, they wrote about a goddess of reincarnation called Arianrhod. And Arianrhod is Corona Borealis. So above Stonehenge in that era was the Celtic goddess of reincarnation, and she was said to be able to look into the souls of mankind and to understand their karma and dish out, a kind of fate or new reincarnation because of that. But more than that, today, Corona Borealis is going to undergo very soon what's called a nova. A nova is when the particular star in that constellation, Gemma, the brightest one, becomes even brighter. At the moment, it's dimming down, but it will soon kind of burst. So I think that's almost like a bit of a reactivation of Stonehenge to do with reincarnation. So we could look out for that now. It's a beautiful constellation. There's like a C shape that's upside down, like a curvature. And it's really very, very pretty and easy to spot in the nighttime sky. So that's something we can look out for today.
You've mentioned that Stonehenge was once a healing center with specific stones that emitted things like heat or water. How was it that you came to that, and what role might these have played in, or well, specifically, I think you did it through dowsing, but what role might have that played in discovering?
Yes, I got to the conclusion that part of it was a healing temple because of what was said in the 12th century by a writer called Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote the History of the Kings of Britain. It's a very famous book, still in print from the 12th century, in which he says, "No stone at Stonehenge doth not have healing power." Then John Aubrey later in 1600s, he too said Stonehenge is for healing. So it was time and again that it was said it was for healing. And the two altar stones, I was one of the first in modern times to discuss the two altar stones. I created a real kind of surge of interest in this, but I wrote about it first in my book. And those two altar stones, one of which was for healing. And it's interesting to note that the god of healing, Apollo, according to very ancient traditions across the British Isles, says that the healing god Apollo leaves his temple in Delphi, Greece, at the winter solstice and manifests at Stonehenge. That's written in a lot of what's called cog almanacs. And a cog almanac is basically a very visual almanac because people in the medieval times couldn't read or write. So they had a very visual calendar, like a big sun for the summer solstice, for example. And in that it says Apollo goes for healing, to give healing at Stonehenge at the winter solstice. So that's why I arose with that. It's in ancient traditions. The other altar stone, which is still there, one of the altar stones got stolen by a member of the royal family, James I, in 1624. But the other altar stone, I think, was for oracles, because again, more ancient writers were saying there was oracles said at Stonehenge. So I think one was for healing and one was for oracles. And if we look to the phenomena of ultrasound is being recorded, released from standing stones at places like Rollright in Oxfordshire. That's a small stone circle, very charismatic stone circle. It's said that at particular times of the year, especially around the equinox, they can release this ultrasound. Now, I think it's related to the summer solstice sunrise and the midwinter sunset at Stonehenge, because it's a known fact that when it's sunrise or sunset, it's a beautiful red sky. Quite often there's a lot of red light there, and in that red light you have microwaves and radio waves. Microwaves can be transduced, especially if they pass through a piezoelectric material, of which the stones of Stonehenge are, and the wavelength stays the same, but the electromagnetic material becomes pressure, push pressure through the atmosphere, and it becomes sound, ultrasound. So I think that the standing stones that were in alignment, of which the altar stones were at Stonehenge, they would have received that microwave energy and transduced it into ultrasound. And I think maybe that was part of the oracle process.
When you said piezoelectric, that flipped a switch to my mind, because we're talking about substances that are able to generate electric charges, usually in response to some kind of stress. And they're typically we find it's the most often with quartz. That's why we use quartz in watches, quartz crystals. This is piezoelectricity, right? And so what you're saying is some of these standing stones, they produce piezoelectricity during specific times of the year. That's interesting to me.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that is a known fact, because they do have a lot of crystal content within them, making them piezoelectric. And even the ones that aren't necessarily, like limestone, I mentioned Rollright earlier, they too have been recorded. I mean, this is recordable. You can record the ultrasound. That's the fascinating thing. We can take this from the realm of theory to the realm of actuality.
So one of the things that you point out, and I agree with this, is that traditional archaeology overlooks or even dismisses certain findings, specifically as you write about Stonehenge. What do you believe may have been the most significant oversight there?
Well, one of the most significant, I think, is the fact that the very early ancient Britons had long skulls. They were also quite short. There's a lot of talk about giants. They came much later at Stonehenge, if indeed they were that tall. But when we go back to the Neolithic and the people that built it, the ADNA is quite clear, ancient DNA. It shows that they had a height of roughly 5 feet, 5'4" tops for males, and 4'9" for the women. About the size of King Tut and Nefertiti, for example, they weren't huge either. So I noticed as well that their long skulls made their ear placement look quite different, set further back, so to speak. And anthropological reports noted that the ear bones were different. So perhaps, if that is the case, could they have heard certain sounds that we couldn't? Maybe even ultrasound is a possibility. So I think that was a great find that was missed and written out of history, although some archaeologists are coming round to the fact. And I discovered one of the very extended long skulls quite close to Stonehenge. The other, I think, again, good find around Stonehenge is that the much later round-skulled people that were indeed tall, it's disputable of how tall that these people were. They also practiced cranial deformation to make their skulls rounder. Now, the elongated skulls were natural. They were long-skulled naturally, but the elite, the rulers, the priests, and the priestesses, they did practice cranial deformation to extend it even more. But you did originally have a long skull. So you get the hyper elongated of the Neolithic and the lesser elongated as well. So they were distinguishing themselves.
Yeah, so what they're doing is they're copying a race that may have been superior to themselves.
That has been said by people like Brian Forster and many others besides, and Brian was kind enough to forward my book. It is very intriguing because if an elongated skulled person was by me now, their head proportion is very different to ours. Ours is 1/8 of our body, and that's how artists and clothes designers, hat designers, they all work upon that fact. The elongated skulled people of ancient Stonehenge, theirs was 1/10. So even though they had elongated skulls, they were smaller. Their heads, in proportion to their body, was quite small. So you'd do a double take. If one was by you now, you certainly would.
Well, yeah, you would. Yeah, we're not talking about individuals who are. We're not talking about people who would have been like the Neanderthal. Neanderthals wouldn't fit those parameters. Their skull shape is way different than that. So we are talking about a unique peoples group, a unique hominid peoples and culture, etc. That gets mimicked later on in time, like you said, through head binding. Something that seems to be similar with the way they are buried is almost like early Egyptian. Was that a finding that you found too?
Yes, that's correct. For example, around 3100 BC in ancient Egypt to about 2900, could be give or take a century or so. What was happening there is the ruler, the pharaoh, he would be placed when he died into a chamber alongside his servants, some people would call slaves. But that was an honor because they believed that they were going to a much better place in the afterlife, the field of reeds, or a Christian heaven, if you will. And so it wasn't considered, a horrible thing that we might see today. Far from it. And in ancient Stonehenge, I noticed exactly the same was in occurrence in exactly the same era. So what was happening there, the hyper-elongated skulled people, they showed no signs of violence whatsoever, but the lesser long-skulled people, they had been ritually killed and placed in with them. And that didn't just happen once around Stonehenge, that happened time and again. I list numerous examples in my book. So that was a practice, just like in ancient Egypt. So I think it's not coincidental that in exactly the same eras, two different cultures separated by thousands of miles were behaving identically.
And then we compared the body shape, like you said, to King Tutankhamun or Nefertiti, these individuals who were, we don't today. Today people are kind of a whole lot taller, and you're right, they would have been shorter individuals is pretty common. But they too had noticeably elongated skulls. And I was curious as if there is any evidence of some kind of trade. Well, maybe not necessarily a trade, but the early peoples in this time period, way back 7,000 Neolithic or whatever period, may have come, in fact, from the Egyptian area. What do you think of that?
The aDNA tests that have been done on what archaeologists called the Neolithic, which are long-skulled, although they don't call them long-skulled, they just use the word Neolithic, has been done. And it was noticed that their skin was certainly more Mediterranean-looking. That is a fact, but with blue eyes. That's what's believed to be in occurrence. And there probably was some type of link because you've got a Mediterranean-looking people, okay, now practicing similar things. And it wasn't until the Beaker culture came to the British Isles around about 2500 BC. They were much fairer, much taller, with round skulls. And by 2480 BC, according to Professor Ian Barnes, who's an expert in ancient DNA, he claims through his research that by that period, 2480 BC, all the ancient DNA of the long skull had been eradicated. But more than that, he points out that when they did arrive, the tall beaker culture, which is again a fact, they did not interact or intermarry with the long-skulled people for about 500 years. So these people were living separately, which is extraordinary when you think of how diverse our cultures are today. These people were separated maybe through spirituality, through cultural differences, through identity, by being so dissimilar to one another.
And you mentioned in your answer, that these individuals had blue eyes. And so we would look back at like the Egyptians. I think they typically had brown eyes. I think sometimes there'd be an aberration where you'd have green eyes. And I think that's kind of where the Set deity may have been depicted that way, or he may be a representation of something from the north. Actually, I almost believe that Set was a imported god from the British Isles because he's redheaded and green-eyed, and that's a ginger look,
Absolutely. I mean, when we look at these type of reports, these type of documentation, it does link cultures one way or the other, or it's they wrote things down because that's what they thought they saw, that's what they thought was in occurrence at that time. And not just that, when we look to the Bronze Age, which is a bit later than the Neolithic period, the Bronze Age starts around about 2500 BC in the British Isles, we notice being imported, probably from the Mediterranean or Egypt itself, faience beads, and they're really bright blue, piercing blue beads, designed from like a copper base, very popular throughout Egypt and the Mediterranean. And yes, they're found in Bronze Age round barrows. And then according to an antiquarian report, he found what he claimed, what he saw at the British Museum in an Egyptian collection, one of those little mummy dolls that go into the Egyptian tombs, which are shaptis, I think they're pronounced. That may be incorrect. But that's what he claimed he found in one barrow. So we can do quite a few cultural trade or exchange links between the two countries.
Yeah, so I mean, with blue eyes, I mean, we see that coming from, I think, the Baltic Sea region. I think that's what archaeologists say. And so, of course, if it's coming over to British Isles, that's unique. Something that is interesting to me, and it seems to parallel the cultures that have elongated skulls or elongated skull. I'm going to use the word worship. I don't mean it in the Christian sense, but they have some kind of deification of the elongated skull to the point where people in the Middle East would deform babies, infants, to the point where they would have to crawl to move around. I mean, this is something that's recently uncovered. And the idea that cultures would view these elongated skulls as some kind of serpentine, does that seem to bear out in what you found with these shorter elongated skull peoples of the Neolithic and the Stonehenge region?
Well, what I do know is that's a very interesting concept. But what I do know is that they were quite, even though they were short, they were quite heavily built as well. So it's very difficult to really dive into what they're, apart from they were building ancient sites, who these people were, because it's difficult. I mean, I photographed numerous examples across the British Isles for my book and with antiquarian drawings of them as well. But it's difficult to try and ascertain too much because you can't just handle human remains. You have to have good reason in which to do so. And it's interesting, I was in America around Chaco Canyon last month. It was an Aztec ruins, and it was mentioned there that those ancient indigenous peoples were also that same height as the people of Stonehenge and the people of ancient Egypt as well. So I think there's lots of narratives going on, from small people that may have been called the Fae with their ears set back or some kind of link to that, to much taller people that became known as giants. To have one without the other is not having the full 360-degree understanding of Stonehenge.
So if we have somebody that's some kind of Fae progenitor, a Fae progenitor race, I mean, something where some of this idea may have came from, would we say that the shorter individuals or the taller ones that came later we would call them the Tuatha De Danann then?
Well, what I think is an association between the Tuatha De Danann and the ancient British long-skulled people is the mythology. In the mythology, there was a great battle, and the Tuatha De Danann descended. They were supernatural-like creatures or beings, and they descended into the mounds. And that's where you find all of the elongated people. They descended into the mounds because they were found in the mounds. So I think there's snippets of history that is true that has been woven into mythology. And some of it is, just that mythology, but sometimes it really is history and historical fact that has been long forgotten and dismissed by mainstream archaeologists.
Yeah, because we have stories of people, they are abducted by the Fae. I mean, there's all these tales of actual events and recorded events and people doing things that are designed to appease them. And we have stories of all the Fae creatures all have similarities across the world. I mean, I was talking to somebody about how the duende, which is a South American belief of an entity that's about the size of a modern, of a gnome. I mean, it's like we have this gnomish idea all over the world, and we have one here. And they even talk about how it's in the, in the United States itself. I mean, his Hispanic community has an understanding of the duende even today up wherever they go to. But that's a lot shorter. I mean, we're talking something that's 2 feet tall as opposed to, something that's 4'9" broad. I mean, it's almost dwarven, what you described. They're kind of broad shouldered, but elvish dwarves kind of creatures.
Yes. And when we look in the Celtic ancient manuscripts, they often spoke of elemental beings, and the element of earth would be gnomes, for example. Undines would be the element of water, salamander fire, and sylphs air. So there's always been in our British DNA, if you will, this association between these elemental beings. And you're right, even stories in my hometown, I live near Avebury-Henge in Wiltshire, there has been abductions reported by an antiquarian called John Aubrey of the Fae, where he took somebody into a mound and he felt imprisoned, but eventually he was let out of the mound because he lived to tell the tale that became reported. So it is like these mounds have some kind of magic, some kind of mystical enchantment about them.
And if we move one of the main resources or research methodologies that you use is dowsing. Can you talk or explain how dowsing works in the context of uncovering these hidden histories like that at Stonehenge?
Yes, well, dowsing is the ability to find something that's invisible for many, like underground water is famous for that, water witching, water divining, it's famous. But if we can imagine that you can find lots of other things from earth energies, lays, other things besides, then dowsing can be used for that. How I discovered the elongated skulls, or the start of the journey, I should say, that led to their discovery, was using the ability to map dowse and look at a map and then ask of the map what did it want to show me, which was turning dowsing on its head, because normally you ask the rod or the pendulum to show you something. I said to the map, what do you want me to find in effect? And it led to this barrow, and inside of that barrow was an elongated skulled person, and hence the discovery. So it began it. And I think dowsing can help us. Sometimes it can hinder us because sometimes you can make mistakes. But on the most part, it can, because master dowsers such as Guy Underwood, I inherited all of his published and unpublished surveys from my late father. The wrong book went to print, incidentally, The Pattern of the Past. It has a lot of nonsense in it. But he was a pioneer, and some of his work was very accurate. It's like any pioneer. You're going to get right and you're going to get things wrong. And he always said that around these mounds, you get a particular nexus of energies meeting at them. So they become kind of vortex places. They become this gathering point of lots of energy. So you can look to dowsing to track these energies back to their source. And that's how you do water divining. In water divining, you often track an underground stream to its source, because you don't want to put the well on the underground stream. It might be fluctuating water table, could dry up in the summer. You want gallons per second that are going to last a long time. So you go to the source of that spring. Now, if we turn that into earth energy terms, where you follow earth energies and you go to its source, quite often that source point is going to be a barrow, an ancient site, a pyramid. And so it's not just about ley lines as such. It's always about these earth energy nexus points that create a lot of electromagnetic energy at those points.
Yeah, you've spoken about one such place, and I do believe it was a stone circle, that there was high amounts of gamma radiation detected.
Yes, I discovered that alongside Rodney Hale many, many years ago, actually, when we did radiation readings at the centre of the sanctuary near Avebury. It's a part of the Avebury complex, and Avebury contains the world's largest stone circle. But about 1.5 miles away from Avebury, you have the sanctuary. Today, little exists of it because it was smashed up in 1724 and 1725. And an archaeologist called Maud Cullington marked their former positions with concrete markers. So the stones have long gone. Yeah, but there's marker stones there. And the interesting thing was we got high radiation levels at the center, but the control area just outside of the marker stones, where the former stones would have once stood, it really dipped back down to normal. So something is going on in these places. It's a form of like geophysics that we don't fully understand. And what were the ancients doing with this gamma radiation? Small amounts are said to be healing, large amounts, are clearly not healing. So it's very intriguing that they were drawn to these sites. And there's a place in Scotland that has flare-ups of radiation as well. So it's not just in the south of England that the situation has been recorded. It's been recorded at other stone circles much, much farther north than Avebury or Stonehenge.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing, because we know that high levels of that kind of radiation is pretty harmful to, human cells. I'm probably any kind of biological cell is probably really violent towards. And it's interesting to me because it was way back in the 1990s. There was a group of scientists and experts, and I think the team included linguists, anthropologists, engineers. I mean, it was a big think tank. And their goal was to communicate the dangers of nuclear waste to peoples thousands of years in the future. And you have this area, like you said, in Avebury, and we have, you have a theory that it may have affected peoples in those times differently than it does today for us. But what's the possibility that it's a warning? Hey, this area seems to just be heavily gamma radiation. Stay away.
That is a really interesting concept, actually, and I find that quite fascinating in itself. Having that think tank coming up with that, how are you going to tell the future humanity, the descendants of those that came before? So I find that very, very interesting. To be honest, that like it is some kind of warning system. As it were. So yes, I think that's quite plausible. But one concept I hadn't thought about, but I'm certainly going to give it time and thought.
I mean, I can simply imagine that there was, like I said, places of power are pretty common. We understand that the ancients have sites on, the hubs of leylands, the dragon zones or something that some people call them, where this is a heavy area of cosmic power and energy. And there's a burial mound here or an ancient site built here. And then you have something like this, which seems a little bit unique in what has been discovered.
Yes, and also you don't just get ley lines at the places. Everybody's fixated on ley lines because that's the only thing that they know about in geomantic terms without sounding, rude. But there has to be more than just that. There has to be earth currents. There normally an aquifer or some kind of underwater source as well that produces a spiral pattern called a geospiral. And then you have the emergence points of particular types of energies or the convergence points of those as well. When you have more than one thing going on, more than just lays, and you have all of that going on, that's a power center.
And there was there was a burial site you had uncovered of a queen or some person a woman of high importance in a mound that the government has recently come back and covered up with like metal mesh.
That's right. I mean, when I first discovered the elongated High Queen of Stonehenge, as I phrased her, I was able to walk on her mound, and it was, you could go there, but only at certain times of the week because it's on a military no-go zone sometimes. So it could easily become like Area 51, no-go, no civilians, off you go. And sometimes it is open to the general public. And when I first went, it was, the mound was there. When I went back about 5 years later, suddenly it was covered in wire mesh, and that was under the understanding that to stop badgers, they're like a little black and white mammal that live in them, to get in. But when you look to the other very famous long barrows in the area, like West Kennet Long Barrow, Wayland Smithy, I could name lots. They have never had that done because they're in a tourist zone and because tourists will suddenly be horrified that was happening. And because this is on the edge of a military establishment, this barrow, I think it makes it even more poignant. And not only that, they put a no entry sign up across it as well. So suddenly it became a no entry zone with a low fence, actually, that you can just climb over. So it's a bit of a nonsense. And last time I went there with a group, we were finding bullets there. So the military are now using it to practice firing from because it's slightly on high. Do you see what I mean? It's a mound, so it creates an elevated area. So today it's being used to fire weapons from.
Yes, and then when you had found it, you had found that the mound itself, where it sits, there's a couple of different geomantic things going on in that area. Can you explain those?
Yes, I mean, for one, when you walk along this huge long mound, it's the longest in the British Isles, actually, around about, 390 feet long. Even if you just walk along, you feel differently in parts of it. if you're slightly sensitive, and I say slightly sensitive because it's really an outpouring of energy, earth energy, if you will, not lays, earth energy. And these points create areas which I think we can interact with, and that can be quite, for some people, alchemic. They can kind of interact with us, and we can sort of change aspects of ourselves with this type of earth energy. But if we just realize that some monuments were meant to walk around, they really were, like Avebury, like Stonehenge, you're not just going to stay in one place. And it's interacting with these various different energies that I think that the ancients were doing in a processional manner.
So with these, you've explored some of the burial mounds of the United States, haven't you?
Yes, I've tended to focus at this moment in time on Chaco Canyon, Valley of the Canyon of the Ancients in Colorado, and Aztec ruins. So I haven't really fully investigated the mounds there. I know of them, but I haven't thoroughly researched them.
I find them interesting and maybe even parallel a little bit. Because if you're saying that something like an elongated skull peoples this is where we're finding them in the burial mounds, I mean, it's not. The British Isles have been peopled by a lot of different peoples throughout time. I mean, it's just kind of the thing, I mean, from the various Norse cultures to the various European. I mean, it's just been a population place to go. And so I know that some cultures do bury people in mounds. I mean, the Norse are known for this. They bury people in the longships and then they bury them over with dirt. But this is a different thing. And this is what I'm saying. This is a different kinds of things because these aren't giants being buried, right? These are short people with natural occurring elongated skulls being buried, right? Normally, what you hear about with these elongated skulls are these people are kind of giant, taller than the people that they are around, right? So if you go to South America, for example, people with elongated skulls were taller and bigger than the natives, right? And that's what I was wondering is if you're seeing any kind of, I mean, is this like a cultural dynamic of a people who lived and coexisted, well, I won't say coexisted, lived at the same period in geologic time around the world were doing similar things with their people?
Yes, it is interesting because they stand out. They're different. They don't follow the global identity of being tall with elongated skulls. Quite the opposite. And we know this because of the femur bones have been measured, most of which have been measured, and they all give that height. And so we do know that. I think they do just stand apart. They're different. And Pliny the Elder, he was a Greek adventurer, a voyager. He claimed to have gone around the known world, like Africa, all across the Mediterranean to Britain and other places besides. And he wrote a book about what he discovered, Pliny the Elder. And he has some very unusual human being races in that. People with very large extended ears, for example, that look exaggerated, very short people, very tall people. So I think, there's much more to discover if Pliny the Elder, who was a learned gentleman for his era, he was a Greek scholar who said, this is what I saw. So I think we need to keep a very open mind that maybe I have opened Pandora's box with finding the elongated skulled people, but I think there's lots more to be discovered that lie literally under the ground, hidden away, which Pliny saw.
Yeah, and if we were going to switch and talk about Chaco Canyon for a little bit of that, because that's where you're putting some interest. This being the central hub for the ancient Puebloans. I can read the word, I can't say it.
Yeah.
What do you think of the primary purpose of the structures were? Were they primary ceremonial, residential? I mean, what structures are the most interesting to you?
Chaco Canyon consists of predominantly 12 great houses. That's what they're called by archaeologists, who are now considering them to be temples, incidentally. And the largest of which at Chaco is Pueblo Bonito, beautiful city in Spanish. And it was once 4 stories high and contained 800 rooms. It was immense. Okay, it really was a large structure, and it was in a D shape, like a semicircle with a long edge, a D shape. And intriguingly, there's a very powerful D-shaped Earth energy called a secondary halo, and that's what gave that template to why the ancients constructed there, because that represents protection, that particular earth energy pattern, because animals such as hens, when they could fly and before their wings were clipped, and geese, they nest on these and they're hardly molested by foxes. So it led master dowsers to think that it was a protective pattern. That became the template of all the other great houses. Not all of them were sited on that energy, but that shape became the template of it. Now, when we look to Chaco Canyon as well, there's a lot of alignment to the moon and the sun as well, and they incorporate them often into the long side of the building, which can activate earth energies at particular times of the year. And what I also discovered about Chaco Canyon, mainly through the archaeologist Steve Lexon, he noticed and interpreted the Great North Road. The Great North Road is a very straight line that goes up through Chaco Canyon towards Aztec ruin and far beyond, actually. And he called it, a road, but he knew it wasn't a road because it was overworked and underused. Now, that's a ley. And that line, which he calls a meridian line, if you take that ley, it goes all the way down south to Culiacan in Mexico, for example, and Pacume, that's also in Mexico. And they're very interesting sites because they say, for example, at Pacume, that the 2 brothers came from the north, meaning Chaco, it's thought. 2 brothers came from the north, and they were marching down south to Mexico, and they were stopped in their tracks by a hag witch. And this hag witch was carrying this huge lump of iron, shaped like a tortoise. And she said to the 2 brothers, where I throw this piece of iron and where it lands, you're going to build a kingdom, and the other one must keep going south on that kind of meridian line. And archaeologists at the turn of the last centuries, they discovered at one of the temples at Pacume was this, a meteorite, a very, very large meteorite, which is iron. So again, in myths, and in these legends, we're saying 2 people came from the north, came from what would become North America, and they were heading south. And yes, she was carrying iron, apparently, because the meteorite was found. So that's almost like a Mecca. It was wrapped up ceremonial in cloth. It was placed within the temple. So I think, again, we cannot be dismissive of legend and myth, because again, that's proved to be the case of a truth.
Yeah, so we know that the people who lived in Chaco Canyon, they built their multi-story pueblos and their kivas to align with celestial bodies. And this being the case, what celestial body, what constellation, etc., would have been the old hag if we were going to take this story as something a little bit more astrotheology instead of mythology?
Yes, that's really interesting. When we look to just above Four Corners and you go enter Colorado, so to speak, then, and you go to Canyon of the Ancients, you have a very elevated kiva. I think it's the highest kiva altitude in America. Lowry, I think it's called kiva. It's spectacular. I think it's about 12,000 feet above sea level, and it's been calculated by some archaeoastronomers that aligns to the North Pole. The pole star, rather, which is, part of Ursa Major and Ursa Minor. But nonetheless, it's the pole star. It's that still point in time where everything appears to revolve round. And so we do know that particular kiva is. And in some cultures, I'm not sure about the First Nation Native American stories of that, but certainly in other cultures, it's often seen as a female bear, for example, a feminine aggressor and a protector, which is what the bear often symbolizes. But nonetheless, I think more importantly than that, it represents the still point in time. It's where everything goes around, and that's what they knew. They were expert astronomers.
Yeah, when I think of the constellations, I was thinking maybe Cassiopeia might have been something related to this. I mean, if we're talking about people who had their day-to-day lives lived by the stars, I mean, I don't think any archaeologist would disagree with that statement, that these guys were, that they lived with the stars, right? That they understood when a certain star rose on the horizon that it was time to do planting, and when another did it, it was harvest time. I mean, almost like the ancient Egyptians with the star Sirius, for example. And, if I were to say, Cassiopeia is typically depicted as like the seafaring queen, you can almost say, well, this is the constellation that threw, that a meteorite fell, fell. And this is where one of the brothers built their big city and their kingdom. I mean, if I was to take a story and a mythology and build it into something more concrete, not to deny the mythology, of course.
Absolutely. When we turn to Ireland, for instance, and we go to a complex of round cairns, like barrows, cairns they're called in Ireland, and we look to Cassiopeia in the heavens above, it was discovered by James Swagger that the entrances of those cairns, they're separated across a mountain. So imagine them not as being close together, but at the winter solstice, when Cassiopeia is at a particular angle in the sky, all of those stars align to the entrance of those cairns. So to the ancient people, that was very meaningful. And in the Celtic tradition, the later Celtic tradition, it represented the goddess Dawn, who was really all-powerful. Dawn was the mother of the gods. So she was revered in many different aspects. And so Cassiopeia has played its role in cairn alignments. And that could be indeed the case at places, because it's circumpolar, it's visible at different times of the year, and it would be a good source of alignment.
That's interesting that there's that similarity. I mean, it's almost sharing something. I mean, yes, I'm probably drawing a leap between the ancient peoples of Chaco Canyon and then a culture in Ireland. But I don't think such a thing as really honest shouldn't be discounted. I think there's plenty of things that are showing that these cultures may not have directly interacted, but there was some kind of interaction between them. As many of their discoveries or actions or activities seem to be similar at the same time in geologic time.
Yes, and like I mentioned earlier at Stonehenge, we have, Corona Borealis at the exact zenith at midnight at the spring equinox, for instance, which was clearly meaningful to these people. And again, we're looking at a goddess figure. She was a lunar goddess, like I said, the goddess rather of reincarnation. And when we feel about the energies of these gods and goddesses, they have their roles. I mean, you were talking about Set, earlier, and Isis and Osiris. They have their roles with that. And so I think certain temples had their roles that were associated with particular gods or goddesses. And for instance, at Stonehenge Phase 1, there was more women cremations found in deposits in that phase than men. So it was a kind of, a feminine goddess place you could interpret that as. And when we come to Chaco Canyon, you're talking about similarities. Well, one thing I did notice in similarities between the two culture is what the shamanic priesthood wore. For instance, it has been found in the early burials in room 33 at Chaco Canyon, and room 2028, that they were wearing turquoise, blue, and jet, for instance, and they were buried with artifacts. And in the plaster at room number 28, which is, you can't enter it, Chaco, they displayed 6 fingers and 6 toes, and that's quite well documented in that area. When we took our attention to Stonehenge, what were they wearing, the shamanic priesthood? Jet. And they didn't have turquoise, that wasn't around at the time, but they did have very bright faience beads of blue. And what was also noticed about the Stonehenge people that I uncovered was they were buried differently. The shamanic priests were buried in a different manner. They wouldn't be in the fetal position, that was quite common. They would be laid out to rest. And certain artifacts, such as an oar, that's like a long piece of metal, was analyzed recently under a very powerful microscope, and that was found to contain black pigment for tattooing. So these people were highly tattooed. And also they wore spacers in their ears. And of jet, they were analysed. They were thought to have been buttons. And now it's realised that they were spacers. So you've got a culture wearing very similar things. In Stonehenge, they're wearing spacers in their ears and being highly tattooed. Well, you've got a generation now, Gen Z, that do that. I mean, are we talking about reincarnation? You start to look at similarities across time. You really do, and you can either dismiss that, or it can be a coincidence, or it could have some kind of meaning behind it.
Have you read anything about like Karahan or Gulbekki Tepe? Have you seen anything like that?
I've done some absent dowsing there. I hope to go with some clients of mine, and that's proven to be quite interesting. But it's said to be one of the oldest temples in the world. You can go back to 12,000, BC. But I think we can't dismiss the sites here to be correctly managed in their dating. My colleague, John Cowie, the late John Cowie, late and great John Cowie, he wrote a book about Silbury Hill with an alien connection. Actually, that was his take on Silbury Hill. But he had the good fortune, as indeed I did myself, to enter the last excavation that took you right into that mound. Okay, now on the old surface level, that's the first surface level, everything's been built above that surface level. There was a layering of flint, lithics, so pieces of flint basically, all on the old surface level, dating to 12,000 BC. So you could say that mound that's been dated to 2480 BC has its genesis in some of the oldest temples in the world. So I don't just think it's in one place where you could say that it's 12,000 BC. I think we're going to find that date to be actually quite common.
Definitely. Around the world.
Indeed, around the world, yes.
So where can people find more of you and tell us more about anything that you're working on or anything that you would like to point listeners to?
Yes, well, my websites are esotericcollege.com. You can find me there. You can go to my other website of my tours, which is the Avebury, that's AVEBURY, the Avebury Experience.co.uk, because I will be doing more tours, and I'm going to be in ancient America again. Next May the 3rd and 4th, I'm going to be at America Stonehenge, leading a tour. You can find out more about that at the Avebury Experience.co.uk. I'm also going to return to Chaco Canyon and Aztec ruins and Mesa Verde as well next year, and that will be on my website soon. And I'll be off to Egypt and Malta as well. They're going to be on my website quite soon. I teach online as well, Dowsing and other subjects, and that's at esotericcollege.com. And you can find my book, The Secret History of Stonehenge, about the 2 altar stones and how a king stole them. And it's a fantastic story with how stone settings were buried because they didn't fit the mainstream model at the aveburyexperience.co.uk. But what I hope this interview has galvanized is an interest into the ancient ancestors, because sometimes we look at the sites and they're overwhelming, like Stonehenge and the pyramids, and we forget about the people. And so I hope I've introduced some of your listeners to the elongated skulled people of Stonehenge, those that built the past, and their legacy lives on.
Thank you very much for coming on the show and talking to me about this. This is very, very entertaining, very fun.
Okay, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.